Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Richard B. Splane Lecture in Social Policy. And we're really excited to have Seth Klein speaking on Mobilizing Canada for the climate emergency. My name's Tim Stainton, and I'm going to be your moderator for the night. I'm a professor at the School of Social Work here at UBC Vancouver. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territories of the Tsawwassen people, where I have the privilege of living as a guest on their land. UBC is located on the unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and we are grateful that that we have the pleasure of working on their beautiful territory. And I would invite you all to reflect on the territory you're on currently and honor the traditional keepers of that land. Tonight we're offering closed captioning live transcript service for this. So if you're wanting to make use of that, I'm just going to check my notes. There's a little icon at the bottom of your screen called live transcript with a CC. So if you click on that, there may be a slight delay, but it should trigger the captioning. If you're having any problems with that or anything else, if you put a message into the chat, we will have some folks standing by to help sort out any problems that you might have. After the keynote, we will be taking questions, and we can remind you of this later. The way we're going to do that is using the Q&A function, which is again on the bottom part of your screen. So if you just like to write your questions in there, I anticipate with the number of participants we have, there'll be far more questions than we have time. So I hope you'll forgive me if I moderate those questions, and I will be posing the questions to Seth to respond to. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Patsy George. Patsy is the former chair of the UN Association of British Columbia and one of the originators and founders of the Splane Lectures that I've had the pleasure of co-chairing the committee for the lectures with for, I can't even remember how many years, but it's a lot. And she's going to give us some background on Professor Splane and our partners in this great endeavor. So, Patsy, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Tim. I am Patsy George, and I'm representing the United Nations Association in Canada, Vancouver branch, one of the 3 partners sponsoring this event. I'm speaking from downtown Vancouver and acknowledge that it is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of Coast Salish people, namely Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh. The other 2 partners in this annual memorial event to Dr. Richard B. Splane are the Liu Institute for Global Issues at UBC at the School of Public and Global Affairs and UBC School of Social Work. Your program notes provide additional information about the sponsoring organizations. For those of you who are new to this lecture, it's important that we share a bit of history with you. Again, in your program notes, you will see a short bio of Dr. Splane, who is known to most of us as Dick. As a social policy expert and social reformer, Dick chose the route of public service and academic work to make Canada a better place for ordinary people, the poor, young families with children, people with special needs, seniors, the unemployed, and the newcomers. He believed in engaging the public, particularly the students, in social policy debates where issues of social justice, human rights, and peace are discussed. He truly believed that we can and we must influence the public policy development in this country. In 2006, when Dick turned 90 years old, the UN Association in Vancouver, of which he had served as the president, wanted to do something special. Together with our partners, the idea of an annual lecture in social policy came into being. Dick, with his wife Verna, equally influential in her own right, attended all the lectures until they passed away. Dick passed away after entering his 100th year in the fall of 2015. During the last few years, we've been able to focus on a number of policy areas close to Dick's heart, namely immigrants, immigration, poverty eradication, human rights, pension reform, Indigenous peoples of Canada and the need for reconciliation, homelessness, policies to protect children and advocate for them locally and globally, hunger and food security issues, and guaranteed annual income. Those of us who are privileged to know Dick personally or were his students know that he truly promoted the idea of public policy. It must include both economic and social policy. Economic development without social development will not bring equality and justice. No doubt in my mind that Dick would be thrilled to read the book by Seth Klein, our guest today, and the approach he promotes to bring about social and economic development and the role of government when we are faced with the climate crisis. Dick's legacy will remain the way he was, instrumental in shaping the Canadian social policy. So welcome everyone to the 14th annual Richard Beverley Splane Lecture in Social Policy and Discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Patsy. We all remember Dick and Verna attended these lectures right up to, I think, till his 99th year. So they were, and always had insightful questions to ask. So we always honor their memory when we convene for this annual lecture. I would now like to introduce Professor Donna Baines, who's the director of the UBC Vancouver School of Social Work. This is her first Splane Lecture because the last one was scheduled to start, I think, 3 days after they declared the pandemic. So we're very pleased to finally welcome Donna to the Splane Lecture. Donna?
Thank you very much, Tim. And I would like to echo a very warm welcome to everyone joining us here this evening for the annual Dick Splane Lecture. And very glad to be here, even if only virtually. It is my very real pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight, Mr. Seth Klein. Though I could use up all of my 5-minute introduction, listing all of Seth's outstanding contributions to public, social, and economic policy debates, I want to do something a little bit different. Seth has many, many accomplishments to his name, and it can start to sound a bit like a very admirable but detached technical list when one just reels them off one after another. Instead, I want to take the huge macro issues that Seth takes on and link them to the level of building an equitable and fair life and strong social movements that Seth always takes on. So in other words, I want to do a thematic introduction. And unfortunately, I only have time to focus on 2 themes, but I think there are many more in Seth's work. So theme number one, Seth is a big thinker. In a world where issues can seem so overwhelming that we frequently focus on small-scale changes and micro interventions, Seth reminds us that the local is inextricably linked to the global, and that the suffering we see among our fellow human beings today is shared by the planet, and that we need to focus on both in order to achieve social justice for either. Seth may not remember this, but I first met him in the 1980s when he was touring Canada as part of SAGE, or Students Against Global Extinction. The youth peace movement, of which we were both a part, with SAGE as a very real and important segment of it, was taking on the huge and overwhelming task of global nuclear disarmament. And we took this on as committed young people so that we could ensure that we had the chance to live our lives and others had a chance to live their lives on this planet, rather than sharing mutually assured nuclear destruction. I emphasize this early example in Seth's life because this big thinking about sharing the planet and creating the conditions under which we might all have a better and more secure future continued throughout Seth's career, and in many ways culminates in this lecture he will give tonight on how to build a Marshall-like plan to halt climate change and build a socially just and sustainable future for all. This overlaps with theme 2. So we're now on to theme 2 of 2. Seth is a joiner and a builder. He helped found and build the very successful BC chapter of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, one of Canada's strongest voices for fair and equitable public policy. He helped found and served as co-chair of the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition. He helped found the advisory committee for the Metro Vancouver Living Wage for Families campaign. He helped found Next Up, a leadership program for young people committed to social and environmental justice, And he has participated in numerous research studies, media, and social activist events. Seth also publishes extensively, and his writing invites us to think about how we can join and build a better, kinder, more inclusive, and environmentally sustainable world. Seth forgets no one in these plans and provides us with a very real and very achievable strategies and goals. So on that thematic note, I would like to invite Seth Klein to share his very important current work on building a government-led mass participation movement to mobilize Canada for climate and social justice. Thank you, Seth.
Hi. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Donna, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, Tim and Patsy. I'm thrilled that so many of you have joined us tonight on the Zoom. It looks like there's about 150 of you, Zoom fatigue notwithstanding. So thank you all for your interest. I am also joining you with gratitude from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Let me start by saying how very honored I am to have been invited to give the annual Splane Lecture, a lecture that I've attended a number of times in the past. So my thanks to the UBC School of Social Work and the UBC School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and to the Vancouver branch of the United Nations Association. Just to put a teaser out there, there are a couple of unexpected connections between Richard Splane and the story I want to share with you tonight, but you're going to have to stick around for that. I'm just going to leave you in suspense on that score. So drawing upon my recent book, I'm going to give a 30 to 40 minute talk about how to mobilize Canada for the climate emergency. But given that this invite emanates from the School of Social Work, I want to in particular draw out connections I see between this climate imperative and inequality and social justice. And then I'm looking forward to a spirited discussion and Q&A. This is my book, by the way. A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. It's my first book. It is my hope and belief that the book calls on us to adopt an entirely new and different approach to the climate crisis than the one that we've pursued to date. And while I've endeavored to tell the truth about the severity of the crisis that we face, since releasing the book in September and the feedback that I've had, people are also telling me that they are finding it an unusually hopeful book, notwithstanding the subject matter. And I'm very pleased to hear that. The book's original twist is that, as the title suggests, the book is structured entirely around lessons from the Second World War. Prior to joining the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives 2 decades ago, I was actually briefly a high school socials teacher. And one nice spin-off benefit of my book, I hope anyway, is that it has this potential to make the study of World War II newly relevant to young people today, linking as it does our wartime experience to today's most pressing existential challenge. And make no mistake, that is what the climate crisis represents. If we fail to act quickly, then over the course of the rest of this century, things start to get very grim. A world that is unlivable and catastrophic for many, deeply uncomfortable and disruptive for all others, and quite possibly ungovernable. It is an ecological crisis, but it is just as equally a human and social justice crisis and a civilizational threat. Or put another way, over the lifespan of UBC's current and future students, the climate emergency will be the defining issue of their lives. Now, let me state right at the outset that there's no small irony in me coming to this framework that I'm invoking. And like many of you, I'm sure, I too wrestle with this war analogy. As Donna alluded to, my own political activism started as a teenager in the peace and disarmament movement of the 1980s. And moreover, I am the child of Vietnam War resistors. That is in fact how I happen to be Canadian. But I am now strongly of the view that climate breakdown requires a new mindset to mobilize all of society and galvanize our politics and to fundamentally remake our economy. And here's why. And Joelle, I'm hoping you can just call up that chart if you can. I'm forever a CCPA person, so there's got to be a chart here. I think we need a new approach because what we have been doing in response to the climate crisis thus far simply isn't working. So the chart shows Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back over the last 20 years. What you basically see is a plateaued line, meaning emissions are no longer climbing, but neither are they in decline. So despite decades of calls to action, our emissions are not on a path to stave off a horrific future for our children and future generations. We have run out the clock with distracting debates about incremental changes, but where it matters most, actual GHG emissions, we have accomplished precious little. The great climate change warrior Bill McKibben says, winning slowly on climate is just another way of losing. Politics, as they say, may be all about compromise and the art of the possible, but there is no bargaining with the laws of nature. And nature is now telling us something fierce. Thanks, you can put away the slide now. So here we all are, confronting this harrowing gap between what the science says we must do and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. Now, interestingly, I didn't start off planning to write a war story. My book project began as an exploration for how we can align our politics and economy in Canada with what the science says we urgently have to do. And the book is that. But initially, I had planned to include only a single chapter on lessons from the Second World War, because I'd long been intrigued by World War II as an example of rapid economic transformation. But as I delved into that work, I began to see more and more parallels between our wartime experience and the current crisis, and ultimately decided to structure the entire book around lessons from our wartime experience. Again, not because I get weirdly animated about war, but it's because I see in this history a helpful and indeed hopeful reminder that we have done this before. We have mobilized in common cause across society to confront an existential threat, and in the process, we have retooled our entire economy twice, in fact, once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert back to peacetime, all in the space of a few short years. So the book explores what wartime scale mobilization could actually mean and look like. And each chapter jumps back and forth in time between stories of what we did in the war and what we now face. And in these comparisons, it answers questions like, how has public opinion rallied to support mobilization in the war? How might it be galvanized again? What was the role of government, the news media, arts, and culture? How was social solidarity secured across class and race and gender? And can we do so again? What's the connection to inequality in that endeavor? How was national unity established across Canada's many provinces with their varying interests? And can we successfully achieve that again as we move off fossil fuels? How did we marshal all of our resources to produce what was needed? And how might we do that again? How did we pay for that transformation? And can we mobilize the necessary finances once again? Interestingly, what supports were offered for returning soldiers? And is there a model there for just transition for fossil fuel workers today? What was the role of Indigenous people in the war, and what is it in today's transformation? What was the role of youth and social movements then and now? But importantly as well, while most of the chapters laud what Canada did in the war. A couple of the chapters deal with the war's cautionary tales, the warnings of things that brought us shame, the internments, the squashing of civil rights, the poisoning of Indigenous lands, and perhaps most apt to the current crisis, the response to refugees. So what were those things that we do not wish to repeat as we mobilize once again? And running through the book is really this question of what sort of political leadership do we require to see us through challenges like this? And I want to start with one important comparison I make near the beginning because it gives me some hope, and it's this. Despite Canada's war declaration in September of 1939, it's worth recalling that even as the winds of war gathered in the late 1930s, our leaders, and actually much of the public, were reluctant to recognize what would ultimately be necessary, a lot like today. Canada was on the cusp of being completely transformed by its Second World War experience, yet right up to the 11th hour, our government and most of the public still hoped to avoid being dragged into that fight. And I feel like that's where we find ourselves again today, in this similar awkward period where, the summer before last, the federal government passes a climate emergency motion in the House of Commons one day and then reapproves the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion the very next day. That is a dynamic that I call the new climate denialism at play. It's a concept I unpack in the book, but I am convinced that, as with the Second World War, this phony war period isn't going to last, that it is in fact about to end. And this is one of the book's important lessons, that emergencies, once recognized, they transform society, they transform social relations and the economy and our leaders themselves. And I find, I published the book, or didn't publish it, I sent it off for final copy edit 3 days before the first lockdown. So it was written before the pandemic. But now that we've had the year that we've just had, I have found myself thinking a lot about the comparisons between that wartime mobilization and the pandemic and the climate crisis we now face, and noodling over what is the alchemy of these moments, that the combination of events and leadership that shift the zeitgeist and move our leadership into emergency mode. If you had said to Canadians in 1938, this gang in Mackenzie King's government, do they have it in them to completely transform Canadian society and the economy as was about to happen? I'm quite certain most Canadians would have said, no, not this gang. And similarly, if you had said to me a year ago, are there people at Finance Canada and the Bank of Canada with the audacity to quickly pivot and create these programs that we've seen? I probably would have said, no, I don't think so. There's no one home who thinks that way. And I would have been wrong. There was no unity in Canada in 1939 at the outset of the war, but it came. In fact, it makes for an interesting contrast when we think about the Supreme Court decision last week and on the carbon pricing and the sort of temper tantrums that we've seen from some conservative premiers over something as modest as carbon pricing. In the war, Mackenzie King had to contend with some equally troublesome premiers, many of whom really didn't like him very much. But something extraordinary happens once people recognize an emergency for what it is. And in the war, all of those premiers chose to forfeit authority over individual and corporate taxation to the federal government for the duration of the war until the emergency was over. It's extraordinary what becomes possible in an emergency. And now we've just lived through something like that again. I think after 40 years of really where the most insidious legacy of the neoliberal agenda has been the sapping of our sense of possibility and our imagination and our collective faith and our capacity to undertake great tasks together. The pandemic emergency has shown us how quickly we can change our ways and how swiftly we can throw out the rule book. And so in some important ways, our sense of imagination is restored. I want to share a story of a Second World War vet from the book, a man named C.G. Gifford. Those who served overseas during the war came back forever changed, and some of them drew lessons from their war experience that motivated them to fight for peace and human survival for the rest of their lives. They never stopped doing what they could to secure our collective future. When I was a teenage peace activist in that era, when I first met Donna and her partner Jim in the 1980s, I had the great fortune of getting to meet some of those vets, including this man, Gifford, a lovely guy, and co-founder and longtime chair of an organization called Veterans Against Nuclear Arms, or VANA. Gifford was raised in a pacifist household, but as he watched the rise of fascism as a young man in the 1930s, he became convinced that Hitler had to be stopped. He joined the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1941, became a navigator, flew 49 bombing raids, and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Gifford and a handful of other vets founded VANA in Halifax in 1982, when the Cold War nuclear arms race were still in full swing, and then US President Ronald Reagan talked about fighting and winning a limited nuclear war. And alarmed by talk like that and fearing for our future, it wasn't long before VANA chapters had sprung up in cities across Canada and grew to about 800 members, most of them Second World War vets. And they'd attend peace marches and Remembrance Day ceremonies wearing these white berets to symbolize both their past in the military and their desire for peace. After the war, Gifford became a social worker and then a university professor, eventually becoming the director of the School of Social Work at Dalhousie University. He died in 1993. Those VANA vets aren't with us anymore now as we face down the climate emergency, but if they were, I've no doubt that they would be in this fight and marching with the student climate strikers. So they really led the way, taking lessons from the Second World War to confront global crises in the present. And isn't it an odd coincidence that another RCAF pilot by the name of none other than Richard Splane, the man for whom this lecture is named, who, like Giff, flew Lancaster bombers in World War II, would also go on to become a professor of social work and head of a university school of social work on the other side of the country, no less. And just as Giff would throw himself into the work of VANA, Richard Splane would devote himself to the World Federalists and the United Nations Association, seeking to take from his wartime experience that exactly right lesson, namely that we must all mobilize and unite across borders in the face of civilizational threats. Anyway, I'm getting distracted. So since releasing my book in September, I've given a lot of talks, a lot of media interviews, and invariably I get asked, how do you know when a government gets the emergency? And I've been forced to distill this 400-page book into what I call my 4 markers of when you know that a government has shifted into emergency mode. So here are my 4 markers, and in the Q&A, I wrote up an article summarizing these 4 markers for policy options, and I'll throw it in the chat. But here they are. 1, it spends what it takes to win. 2, it creates new economic institutions to get the job done. 3, it shifts from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures as needed. And 4th, it tells the truth. It tells the truth about the severity of the crisis and communicates a sense of urgency about the measures necessary to combat it. Now, during the Second World War, the Canadian government did all 4 of these things. And likewise, in response to the pandemic, I would say our governments have mostly passed all 4 markers. But with respect to the climate emergency, so far anyway, neither our federal government nor any provincial government are hitting any of those 4 markers. So I want to explore each of these indicators with you, these markers, along with a few other key lessons I draw from our Second World War experience. In the book, I group all of these lessons into what I call the battle plan for climate mobilization. It's a 14-point plan outlining what it looks like to adopt an emergency mindset and do what it takes to win. I'm not going to go through all 14 points because that would take too long, don't worry, but I want to highlight a few. So that first marker, spend what it takes to win. A benefit of an emergency mentality is that it forces governments out of an austerity mindset. This year, in response to the COVID emergency, Canada's debt to GDP ratio is going to rise from about 30% to about 50%. Now that's a big jump in a single year, but at the end of the Second World War, it was more than double that, well over 100%. And when C.D. Howe was the minister in the King government who oversaw Canada's military production and oversaw this tenfold increase in government spending during the war. And when he was pressed about government spending, he famously replied, if we lose the war, nothing will matter. And in order to finance the war effort, the government issued new public victory bonds and new forms of progressive taxation were instituted, including a cap, by the way, on profits. The kind of profiteering that we have seen in this pandemic was illegal in the Second World War. So I believe as we confront the climate emergency, we're going to need to finance the transformation before us employing similar tools. But right now, the federal government and provincial government on climate action, the spending on climate action and green infrastructure pales in comparison to both the war and the pandemic response. Let me give you one illustration. Since the first lockdown a year ago, the Bank of Canada has been buying up government securities, federal government securities, in order to finance the emergency response to the tune of $5 billion a week. In contrast, the Trudeau government is spending on climate about $5 billion a year. So the Trudeau and the Horgan governments aren't merely spending a little less than they should in the face of the climate emergency, they are spending less by about a 10-fold order of magnitude. Lesson or marker number 2, create the economic institutions needed to get the job done. During the Second World War, starting from a base of virtually nothing, the Canadian economy and its labor force pumped out a volume of military equipment that is simply jaw-dropping. During those 6 years, Canada, with a population less than a third what it is today, produced 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. 16,000 military aircraft, ultimately building the 4th largest air force in the world at the time. And here in our province, where we seem to struggle to build a single BC ferry anymore, we produced over 300 ships, again, from a base of virtually nothing. I want to see if I can screen share one little picture for you. There you are. Hopefully you can see it. That's C.D. Howe, where he checking in to see the 500,000th military vehicle leave the assembly line, just to give you a little taste. Remarkably, the Canadian government, under the leadership of C.D. Howe, established 28 Crown corporations in order to meet the supply and munitions requirements of the war effort. So Howe, I've become fascinated with this guy. He was seized with the task. He was no lefty. He was on the right wing of the Mackenzie King government. He'd made a lot of money in the private sector, but he was in a hurry. And anytime the private sector couldn't quickly do what needed doing, he would create another Crown enterprise. He also undertook detailed economic planning to ensure that wartime production was prioritized. For every key input, machine tools, rubber, fuel, coal, steel, you name it, they were carefully controlling and coordinating the supply chains in order to ensure that wartime production was prioritized. Similarly, during this pandemic, I think we've witnessed the federal government create these audacious new programs like the emergency response benefit and the emergency wage subsidy with a speed that few of us would have predicted. But in response to the climate emergency, we've seen nothing of this sort. So in contrast to C.D. Howe's wartime creations, the Trudeau government, in its time in office, has created 2 new Crown corporations, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is basically a vehicle for privatizing infrastructure. And you know what the other one is? I hate to tell you, it's the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation. It's the one that makes us all the shared owners of a 60-year-old oil pipeline from Alberta to this province. If our government really saw the climate emergency as an emergency, it would, like C.D. Howe did, quickly conduct an inventory of all of our conversion needs and determine how many heat pumps and solar arrays and wind farms and electric buses, etc., we're going to need to electrify virtually everything and end our reliance on fossil fuels. And then it would establish a new generation of public corporations to ensure that those items are manufactured and deployed at the requisite scale. Marker number 3, shift from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. Now, I showed you that chart earlier with our GHG emissions going back the last 20 years. Why is it that the best we have done is flatline? I think a major reason for that is that if you survey all of our federal and provincial climate actions to date, you know what they almost all have in common? They're voluntary. We encourage change. We incentivize change. We offer rebates. We send price signals. What we have decidedly not done is require change. If we're going to meet the GHG targets we now must urgently need to hit, we need to set clear near-term dates by which certain things will be required. For example, we would declare that you'll no longer be allowed to buy or sell a new fossil fuel burning vehicle as of 2025. We would mandate that all new buildings will not be permitted to use natural gas or other fossil fuels for heating as of next year. We would ban advertising by fossil fuel vehicles and gas stations. That's how we would make clear that this is serious. Which brings me to lesson or marker number 4. Tell the truth and rally the public at every turn. Now, as I said earlier, many assume that at the outbreak of the Second World War, everyone understood the threat and was ready to rally. That's not true. It took leadership to mobilize the public. In frequency and in tone, in words and in action, emergencies need to look and sound and feel like emergencies. And the leaders that we best remember from the Second World War were these outstanding communicators who were forthright with the public about the gravity of the crisis and yet still managed to impart hope. And their messages were amplified by a news media that knew what side of history it wanted to be on, and by an arts and entertainment sector keen to rally the public. Similarly, we've all just lived through that this year, right? Where our governments have modeled emergency communications through the pandemic. The messages are ubiquitous. We receive daily press briefings. We hear regularly from public health officials. The media has taken seriously its duty to provide necessary information on a daily basis. Government leaders and the media have listened to science and health experts. None of that consistency and coherence, however, is present with respect to the climate emergency. When our governments don't act as if the situation is an emergency, or worse, when they send contradictory messages by approving new fossil fuel infrastructure, they are effectively communicating to the public that it's not an emergency. If our current leaders believe we face a climate emergency, we need them to act and speak like it's a damn emergency, and name it and speak constantly about it and rally us at every turn. That's what you do in a crisis. Those are the 4 markers, but I want to, before I open this up to discussion, I want to highlight 3 other lessons from that, drawing from that wartime experience. The 5th lesson is a thread that runs through my book, is that inequality itself is toxic to social solidarity and mass mobilization. There are these climate policy purists out there who say, don't link the need for climate action to inequality and all these social justice issues. Don't make it more complicated than it already is. It's hard enough. Don't weigh it down. And I think they're wrong. I think they're wrong for a few reasons. First, because these issues are intimately connected in many ways. The richer you are, the higher your emissions. The poorer you are, either as a household or a community or a country, the more vulnerable you are to climate change and the more impacted you are by climate policies. But the second reason we need to link these issues of tackling climate with confronting inequality, because that's how we win. A successful mobilization requires that people make common cause across class and race and gender, and that the public have confidence that sacrifices are being made by the rich as well as middle and modest income people. Interestingly, during the First World War, to go even further back in history, inequality undermined social solidarity. It actually undermined recruitment efforts, right? To have some people sacrificing their lives while other people were making a killing with this grotesque profiteering. And so consequently, at the outset of the Second World War, the King was acutely aware of this. He'd lived through it. And so he took bold steps to lessen inequality and to limit excess profits. We saw new progressive taxes introduced during the war. The corporate tax rate went from 18 to 40% during the war, but it didn't stop there. They also brought in this excess profits tax. What they essentially did is they went back to the 4 years, depression years before the war, 1936 to 39. And for every industry, they figured out the average profit during those 4 years. And then they said to every business in the land, large and small, that's your annual limit until the war is over. And so once people hit that limit, if a company hit that limit, their marginal tax rate went to 100%. The war saw the introduction on the flip side of Canada's first major income support programs. Unemployment insurance, 1940. The family allowance, 1944. But that wasn't all. The King government, keen, by the way, to defend itself against a rising threat from the CCF, made social welfare reform and a promise of a more equal and caring society a foundation of its post-war promise. Even as the early years of the war effort were underway, planning was already happening for post-war reconstruction. And it was during the war that one of the country's most transformative social welfare plans was written, the Report on Social Security in Canada, more commonly known as the Marsh Report. Now, it was named for its lead author, economist Leonard Marsh, who had earlier studied at the London School of Economics under Sir William Beveridge. And both Beveridge and Marsh wrote these landmark wartime reports that set out a new progressive social welfare vision for their respective countries. Marsh, who was connected to the League for Social Reconstruction, in some ways an earlier incarnation of the CCPA, proposed in his report that Canada adopt a comprehensive program of social security with enhanced unemployment benefits, transition support for returning soldiers, major public work projects to provide employment, child benefits, old age benefits, maternity leave benefits, health insurance. You see, the whole architecture of the post-war welfare state was written during the war by Marsh. The experience of collective mobilization would transform our society for generations, even if the actual establishment of some of those programs didn't materialize until a few years after the war. And here's why I want to return to my earlier teaser. You see, there are two funny connections in this story to you folks, my hosts, because after the war in 1947, Leonard Marsh came here to UBC's School of Social Work, where he remained until his retirement, helping to educate a generation of post-war social workers in our province. And here's an additional connection, friends, and it has to do once again with the man for whom this lecture is named. As I told you, Richard Splane flew Lancaster bombers in World War II. After the war, and after completing his academic training, Splane spent 2 decades in Ottawa as a senior civil servant, 1952 to 72, implementing many of the ideas in the Marsh Report, not least the creation of the Canada Assistance Plan, before coming to UBC in 1973, the year after Marsh retired. The King government, as soon as they got the Marsh Report, they integrated many of the ideas into the next speech from the throne, understanding that to sustain a society-wide mobilization, it isn't enough to tell people to confront a threat across the sea. You have to make a pledge that the society people will come back to will look different and more just than the one that they're leaving behind. The point in recalling all of this as we face today's threat and the need for mobilization is twofold. First, to appreciate how inequality serves as a barrier to cross-society mobilization. But second, to understand that effective mobilization isn't merely about building more planes and tanks or today wind turbines and solar panels. It requires policies that fulfill a promise that we will better look after one another and offer good jobs and income supports, and that people will be treated with dignity and fairness. When you're asking people to share in a great undertaking, that's how you keep everyone on the bus. And I think those kinds of measures are going to be needed today. And in fact, they find a historic echo in the appeal of the Green New Deal. And polling that I conducted with Abacus Research as part of my research for the book really drives home this point, that when ambitious climate action is linked to tackling inequality, support for that bold climate action doesn't go down, it goes dramatically up. Lesson number 7, in any war, leave no one behind. For me, this comes back down to the issue of jobs. Now, in Canada today, there are about somewhere around 300,000 Canadians who are directly employed in the fossil fuel industry. It's a lot of people, and we need to do something for all of those people. But I want to put that number in perspective. As I said earlier, in the Second World War, we were a population less than a third what we are today. Over 1 million Canadians enlisted in military service, and even more were directly employed in munitions production. Far, far more than are employed in the fossil fuel industry today. After the war, all of those people, first of all those people had to be recruited and trained up, and then after the war, they all had to be reintegrated into a peacetime economy. That too required careful planning and the development of new programs for returning soldiers, from income support to housing support to post-secondary training programs that transformed the face of the post-secondary sector in Canada for a generation, nearly doubling enrollment numbers, and changed the lives of thousands of people. The ambition of those initiatives, I think, is a model for what a just transition can look like today for all those workers whose economic and employment security is currently tied to the fossil fuel economy. and with a special focus on those provinces and regions most reliant on oil and gas production. But if we could do something that big in the Second World War, this task today, it's hard, but it's not nearly as hard. One of the new institutions I've proposed in the book is a new federal transfer program I would call a climate emergency just transition transfer, something big and audacious, $20 to $40 billion a year, but where we would transfer the money, unlike most transfers that transfer the money based on population, we would transfer the money on a formula based on greenhouse gas emissions. So Alberta produces 38% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, far more than their share of the population. They'd get 38% of the money. But we wouldn't send it to Jason Kenney because he's not to be trusted on this. Instead, we would create new just transition agencies in every province, jointly governed by all levels of government and First Nations in those provinces, and put labor and business people on the board and climate experts, so that we can have confidence that the money is being used for the transition before us and for retraining and apprenticeships and so on. When we spend what we should, we can create more jobs than we will be losing. And the final lesson, 7, that I want to offer is this: Indigenous leadership, rights, and title are central to winning. I want to tell you a story about another World War II vet. One morning, as I was writing the book in 2019, a news item came across the radio about the death of Louis Levi Oakes, the last of the Mohawk code talkers from the community of Akwesasne. In fact, I'm going to see if I can't do a little screen share here and show you a picture of him. So maybe you can see that's just a small picture of him on the corner there. It's interesting that much like at the outset of the war, it had been important to Canada to independently declare war from Britain in 1939. The Iroquois Confederacy, of which the Mohawk are members, also independently declared war on Germany, which resulted in many Mohawk men enlisting. Now, Oakes died a couple of years ago at the age of 94. The code talkers were Indigenous soldiers tasked with using their own languages to communicate secret military information among the Allied forces. In news reports after Oakes's death, his daughter revealed that, astonishingly, Oakes hadn't told his family what he did during the war for 7 decades. They had been sworn to secrecy. And so only in his late 80s, when stories of the code talkers were more public, did he finally reveal what he'd done. And then Oakes was awarded a Congressional Silver Medal, and followed by a special honors from the Assembly of First Nations and the Canadian House of Commons. Oakes was one of 17 code talkers from Akwesasne, but there were hundreds of others from Indigenous nations across North America. As the war was unfolding, the secret codes employed by the Allies to communicate plans kept getting broken by Nazi and Japanese forces, until the US Marines discovered that enemy forces were unable to crack Navajo. And ultimately, 33 Indigenous languages were used by various branches of the Allied forces, including a number from Indigenous nations in Canada, like Mohawk and Cree and Tlingit and Ojibwe. But as I learned this, it struck me that there is in this piece of wartime history a tragic irony. Our two countries have spent generations trying to erase Indigenous languages from the earth, literally beating them out of children in residential schools, only to then uncover that these languages were the unbreakable code. That's what they were dubbed in the war, credited as having been vital to victory in certain battles, particularly in the Pacific. And then if we fast forward to today, the same can be said about Indigenous rights and title, which similarly our two countries have spent generations systematically abusing and violating. And yet, as our mainstream politics dithers and dodges on meaningful and coherent climate action over and over again, it is the assertion of Indigenous rights and title that is buying us time, slowing and blocking new fossil fuel projects until our larger politics comes into compliance with the science. A couple final thoughts, and then we'll open this up to discussion. Just as the Second World War ended the Great Depression, as we rebuild from this pandemic, an ambitious climate plan with massive green infrastructure spending, a Green New Deal, could be just what the doctor ordered. A vital and urgent challenge now is to ensure that we use this experience and this opening it creates to catapult our societies into the post-carbon economy and to do as Arundhati Roy urges and ensure this pandemic, like past ones, be used as a portal or a gateway between one world and the next, not to return to yesterday's normal with all of its inequities and fossil fuel reliance. But I want to highlight a notable difference too between the pandemic and this climate crossroads moment we find ourselves in. People talk about COVID fatigue, and that's real. And some people have responded to my thesis by saying, you know, look how quickly we tired of emergency in this pandemic, less than a year. And now you're asking, here you are, Klein, asking people to spend multiple years in emergency mode to tackle the climate crisis. But here's the distinction. The things we are called upon to do in response to the pandemic are anathema to all of our social instincts. We're told to isolate, to stay home, and that's hard. The good news about the climate mobilization is that it calls on us to do precisely the opposite, to get out there and do something grand together. Like many of you, as I read the latest scientific warnings, I'm afraid. And particularly, I feel deep anxiety about the state of the world we are leaving our kids and those who will live out through most of this century and beyond. All of us who take seriously these scientific realities wrestles with despair. Maybe we should be more honest about that. This is the ambiguous time in which we live. The truth is, we don't know if we're going to win this fight, if we're going to rise to this challenge and do what we have to do in time. But consider this. In the Second World War, as I said earlier, from that population at the time of about 11 million people, over 1 million Canadians enlisted. It is a remarkable figure, eh? I mean, talk about mobilization. Yet it's worth appreciating that those who rallied in the face of fascism 80 years ago, likewise, didn't know if they would win. We often forget that there was a good chunk of the war's early years during which the outcome was far from certain. We know how that story ended. They didn't. Yet that generation rallied regardless, and in the process, they surprised themselves by what they were capable of achieving, not only on the battlefront, but the complete transformation on the home front too. And that's the spirit that I think we need today. And I'll stop there. Let's looking forward to your questions and some good discussion.
Okay, well, thank you, Seth. There's a lot to discuss there, so I'm glad we've got a decent amount of time. I have to say, I really appreciated some of your stories and linkages, and I found myself strangely thinking about my family. And maybe that's partly what we all need to do is as luck would have it, my father was a navigator in Lancaster bombers during the Second World War. I'm not sure how many else, but there seem to be a lot of them. But and came back to a Canada that I say was hopeful, was exciting. My father was a rare socialist in our Toronto suburb, and you know, growing up in the latter part of that stuff was very exciting, and you know, there was an optimism generally, right, that grew out of those changes you talked about. And I was also thinking about, as I shared with the other panelists, I had my first grandson today. And it really brought this lecture home to me, because I started to think, what is the world going to be like when he's my age? Is there going to be a world? And what legacy are we leaving for him? So I really felt, I kept really feeling the lecture as much as hearing it. So thank you.
Can I say something about that, Tim? I'm so glad. First of all, I love hearing these connections different people have. And I'm glad that you felt it the way that you did. I'm sure you can appreciate this. You know, as someone who spent 22 years at the CCPA writing policy reports that effectively talk to people's heads, it was fun to write a book structured around a story that could try to speak to people's hearts and heads. And it, you know, when I landed on this structure, I knew framed around the war, I knew that it was a good narrative device, and I knew that it actually jolted my thinking about emergencies. But it has only been in the last 7 months of being out there and giving talks with the book that I have just been stunned at how remarkably resonant this 80-year-old story remains, and how many people and how many institutions continue to have this connection to that story, and that the story lets me make mischief in fun ways with different audiences, where you get to say to people, like, these are the people you admired, and what they did is important to your sense of legacy and purpose. And here we are again, my friends. So who do you want to be?
Yeah, and it seems to me, I mean, one of the things I love about the book is it is hopeful, as you said. It's and reminds us of what we can do as a nation, and makes you feel good about trying to do that, which I think has to happen, because I don't think the science is going to get us there, which we saw with COVID. But let me switch back to the head for a second here, and I'll ask one question, then I'll move to some of the questions from our audience. I'm just wondering, we're in a very different world than post-war in terms of the globalization of capital, globalization of corporatisms, the sort of supranational nature of a lot of the corporate elites. Inequality is now at a level that is just staggering. So how do we deal with that, the issues of globalization, in terms of because they do say, governments have much less power now than they did 50 years ago. So I just wonder what your thoughts on that.
It is a very good question. And I hear you asking both about the different world and globalization, and also about inequality. It is true in some ways that governments have less power. And that is, as I said earlier, that in some ways it's less about concrete power and more about the prevailing ideology. This was the point I was trying to make near the beginning about the most insidious legacy of 40 years of neoliberalism, is that sapping of our faith in our capacity to do great things together through our public institutions. But on this question of whether or not we're such a different world now than we were then, and now with globalization, it makes everything that much harder, and with inequality, it makes social solidarity that much harder. Yes and no, Tim. So globalization makes some of this harder and some of it easier. In some ways, what computers and data make possible today, boy, those wartime planners, this would have blown their mind. Our capacity to actually do economic planning, given the kind of technology we have today. And in some important ways, the technological challenge today is actually less. I mean, we need to mass produce heat pumps and solar panels and wind turbines. Those are all less complicated than military warships and airplanes. So yes and no. But interestingly, the point I particularly want to challenge you on is the inequality thing. In fact, you know what? I might even show you a chart while we're to make my point. Hang on a second, seeing as everybody loves a good chart. Let me see if I can find it. Oh yeah, there we are. Can you see that chart? This is the share of income going to the top 1% in the United Kingdom, the US, and Canada going back 100 years. And you see that famous Piketty U. We actually had the highest levels of inequality in the decades just before World War II. In fact, if you were to zero in on the Canadian line on that chart, the year where we hit our peak of inequality measured as the share of income going to the top 1% was in 1938, the year before the war. So it's not true that we were more cohesive and united as we entered World War II. We were divided and unequal. But then you see how the war jolts this redistribution of income for the next 30 years on those charts. And that is the point. But the thing to appreciate out of this is that we didn't enter that mobilization with new social solidarity and more cohesiveness, that was forged in the doing of that great task together.
All right, that's very informative. Thank you, Seth. Okay, I'm going to try to, the best I can, curate the questions here. I'm just scrolling through. I read one earlier that I thought from Michael, so I think I'll just paraphrase it. But his question was that the plan sounds very top down. So what's the role of the bottom up, the activist and that things?
That's a really good question. I struggle with this in the book, and there is a chapter in the book on the role of civil society. It remains my view that we're going to have to press our elected leaders to get into emergency mode. They're not going to do it. I mean, all evidence from the last number of years is that they will not do it until we force them there. And you know, so I begin that chapter with the famous line from FDR in the 30s when he met with a bunch of labor and social movement leaders who were telling him what had to happen, and he ends the meeting by saying, "You've convinced me, now go out there and make me do it." And I think we're going to have to make them do it. I interviewed many politicians and political insiders for the book as part of the research. And, you know, I wasn't interested in interviewing climate deniers. I only wanted to interview people, political leaders who I thought actually get it, who understand the science, and yet whose governments or political parties are not pursuing an agenda that aligns with what the science says we have to do. And I wanted to press them on why. And in one form or another, they all fell back on some variant of the rejoinder, well, you got to meet the public where they're at, and the public's not there yet. They're waiting for us to force them. Now, the good news is that line that I kept getting was so frustrated me that I commissioned this poll from Abacus to test if that was true. And I found it wasn't true. I found a Canadian public that was ahead of our politics, both in terms of understanding the crisis and their willingness and preparedness to accept bold climate policies. I do think, though, on the top-down piece, that we are somewhat different than we were back then, and less deferential to authority to a certain extent. And so it is going to have to be different. Here's where I wrestle in the book, right? It is my view that to achieve what we now must achieve this decade at the speed and scale that we now have to achieve it, it has to be state-led. But I also think it's possible to do this in a different way. Interestingly, Extinction Rebellion has as one of their key demands the use of citizen assemblies, and I think they're right. I would love to see the widespread use of citizen assemblies as we figure out how to achieve our target. The targets themselves can't be open to debate. Like, Canada needs to reduce its emissions by at least 60% by 2030. But how we achieve that, and achieving that in a just and fair way, is very much an open question. And I would love to see us use citizen assemblies as one form of creative public engagement to figure out the best path forward, and the one that will have the most buy-in and that people can more willingly accept, because it's not sort of imposed from on high.
Okay, thanks, Seth. So I have another question from an anonymous attendee. I'll just read it. With governments hoping that COVID is receding, the talks increasingly turn to balancing the budget in spite of the evidence that job creation and economic growth from climate emergency action. This seems to bode poorly for the massive climate effort that is required. How do you see the situation?
Yeah, another good question. I mean, there's certainly some who worry that having spent as much as we had in this pandemic, now we have no money. Now, that's why I made my earlier point, which is that, well, debt to GDP may be 50% this year with all the COVID spending. It's still less than half what it was at the end of the Second World War. And may I remind you that, we finished the Second World War with a debt to GDP ratio well over 100%. That did not spell economic ruin. It presaged a 30-year period of the strongest economic performance we've ever known. So I actually think the lesson out of the pandemic, and the one that all of us need to make sure rises to the fore, is that what the governments and the Bank of Canada has shown us this year is what was possible all along, if and when we see emergency as an emergency. All these years when we were told there wasn't the money there for the climate emergency or poverty or homelessness, it was there all along. And the Bank of Canada in particular had this extraordinary capacity it chose not to employ until this year to finance a huge amount of it themselves. Now they're doing that to the tune of $300 billion this year. I don't think we need to do that every year. What I say in the book is that if we really want to finance a Green New Deal climate emergency plan, we should be spending about $100 billion a year for the next 10 years. Can we afford that? Absolutely, we can. Through a combination of the Bank of Canada and buying securities and selling green victory bonds and new forms of progressive taxation and wealth taxation, many of which I outline a whole bunch of them in one chapter in the book. It is absolutely affordable.
Okay, thanks, Seth. This thing keeps moving on me just as I'm about to ask the question. So we have a question from Eakin. Like many audience members here this evening, I'm wondering what can be done to change the Canadian government's mindset so that politicians treat the climate crisis as an actual warlike threat. How can we do this?
So in some ways, I feel like this COVID experience helps a little bit because it shows what's possible and the speed by which we can change. This is the challenge that's being posed in this question, right? The curse of climate relative to COVID and the war is that it moves in slow motion. And therefore governments are able to kick the can down the road and leave it to the next gang. And all governments of all political stripes are still suffering through the legacy of neoliberalism. That serves as a kind of straitjacket on our thinking and our ability to do what we need to do. There's also the influence of the fossil fuel industry itself and government efforts to appease them. So this is a political project now to mobilize. The good news is, I think I want to remind us all what kind of momentum was building right up until the pandemic hit, right? A year and a half ago, we had this student-led climate strike day with 1 million people on the streets in Canada, the largest single day of protest in Canadian history. And a few months after that, we had this all across the country, these remarkable solidarity actions in support of the Wet'suwet'en land defenders. None of us had seen anything like that in our lifetime. So that was the momentum that was building. That momentum found expression in a federal election in which parties promising climate action collectively won a majority in a minority parliament, and where climate was, I would say, one of, if not the dominant issues in that debate. So our challenge now is to recapture that momentum that was building, and we were close. There are these social scientists, Chenoweth, and I forget her colleague's name, who have this, they've done this survey of successful, peaceful social mobilizations around the world and across history, and they find this magic number that if a social mobilization sees 3.5% of a population actively engaged, its success becomes virtually assured. Now, we haven't hit 3.5% in Canada, but we're getting close. So we all have to figure out how to give that shape, whether it's protest. For some people, it's peaceful civil disobedience or divestment or what have you. But we have to make it the defining issue again.
And maybe just to paraphrase another question to follow up on that, do you think COVID is going to help in that endeavor? That this albeit tenuous solidarity that we've seen through COVID, do you think that can be leveraged in the climate struggle?
Yeah, well, like I was saying, they're both helpful and unhelpful lessons people may draw from this experience. I believe that on balance, the lessons we will draw and the changes that have occurred through this pandemic are helpful. We emerge from it with more social solidarity than I think we've seen in a generation, more cooperation politically across parties and across the country, new respect for science and scientists, and some new appreciation for the role and value of the role of government and public services, and the pressing need for government-led investment to restore employment. These are all key ingredients as we now turn our attention to the climate emergency.
Okay, so I have a question from Craig. I wonder if you've been following the new Biden administration's messaging and proposed infrastructure spending.
Yeah.
If so, do you think the US may be poised, using your 4 points, to take the climate emergency seriously?
First of all, I love that you're using my 4 markers. I encourage you to use my 4 markers. For me, they become markers by which to assess any political party's plan on climate, or new federal or provincial plan or municipal plan or institutional plan, by the way. UBC could use the 4 markers to assess its climate emergency plan. So to your question, when I heard about Biden's executive orders shortly after he took office, the first thing I did is applied my 4 markers. And it's remarkable, I would say. The US has gone from being, this laggard under Trump and made us look great, to catapulting way over our head. Is the Biden administration proposing to spend what it takes to win? They are, actually. Biden's election platform, he talked about spending $2 trillion over 4 years, or $500 billion a year. You convert that to Canada by dividing by 10, our economy is about the 10th the size, and it's $50 billion a year. Now, I told you earlier, Trudeau is spending $5 billion a year. So Biden is spending way more. Are they creating new institutions to get the job done? Why, yes, they are. Most exciting, I thought, was a proposal right out of the pages of my book for a citizen climate corps, kind of modeled on this Green New Deal employment program. Are they moving from voluntary to mandatory measures? They are. The dates are still off, but Biden's talking about 100% electrification of the grid, or renewable energy by 2035. That's pretty good. And most importantly, perhaps, he's telling the truth. He's actually saying that these industries are going to have to be wound down over the next 20 to 30 years. And we have not had a prime minister or a premier who has been forthright that way in our country.
Okay, thanks. I'm just switching back and forth from the chat to the questions. And Charles, you're another Lank Navigator vet. They're everywhere. I know, really, we've got the entire squadron here. I didn't see your whole question. You only got partway down, so I'm hoping you'll put it in the Q&A, and pardon me if you haven't, because I think we'd like to have your question on par, and one of the best friends of Gifford, so I think he deserves to have his questions heard.
It's about moving from voluntary to required action, I think. I see it in the chat. Is it from Charles Dixon? Is that who you're talking about?
There's the rest of it,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's quite right. I mean, here's why I think it's so important. One of the challenges that we face and we've all experienced this to a certain extent in the pandemic, but also with respect to climate. Most people want to do the right thing, but neither do they want to be a chump. And it irks them if they're going to do the right thing, if they think, what's the point of me doing the right thing if my neighbor isn't? That's a great thing about making things mandatory, is you don't have to worry about your neighbor. Your neighbor's going to have no choice. They got to do it too. That's why I say we need near-term dates around vehicles, around fuel swapping our homes. With all of these things, though, they need to be a combination of policy carrots and sticks. The stick are the dates by which you won't have a choice, you must switch. The carrots are the income supports of different, in various forms, targeted to low and modest income families, or farmers who need to transition, or in certain cases, certain industries where they're going to need assistance, and where we need to provide that assistance. So it's a bit of both, but there's no getting around the need for mandatory. And there's no getting around the need. The reason I harp as well on the need for these new crown corporations, and again, there's an interesting lesson in the pandemic. If you're not creating new crown corporations, the best we can do is try to incentivize somebody else to do what's needed, instead of just getting the job done ourselves. Look at, I mean, there's lots of good that the government has done in the pandemic, but one of the real mess ups, I think, on the part of Trudeau is that, unlike the UK and Australia and a number of other countries, he didn't recreate a crown corporation to mass produce vaccines like we used to have.
Yeah.
And so in the absence of that, we're forever dependent on somebody else to meet our urgent needs. It's the same. It's the same with what we now need to do on climate.
Okay, thanks. Things keep moving on this, but doing my best here. Oh, here's a question from Gordon Janet, which I thought was interesting, and I'm going to add a little bit to it. What's your views on degrowth as a vehicle to tackle climate crisis? The world resources cannot supply the material world we know today. So yeah, I wonder what you think about, how far we need to move away from a growth-based economics, and can we continue growing population-wise, let alone sustain a growth-based economic system?
Mm-hmm. Well, we definitely need to be using fewer resources. My take on this is a little bit more nuanced, I think. I'm much more interested in the question of redistribution than degrowth overall. I think we definitely need a lot less useless consumerism. And there are some people in our society and some people in our world who do a lot more of that than others. There's some people who consume far too much and some people who don't consume as much as they need. And the richest 1% in the world have about the same emissions as the bottom half of humanity. So I'm much more interested in questions of redistribution, both nationally and internationally, than I am in questions of population or a growth per se. I also think, when we measure what is economic growth in terms of economic activity, I actually think that the task ahead of us for the next 10 to 20 years, as we retool our economy and so on, is so great. And the investment that is going to be needed, public and private sector, is so great that it's probably going to be on net positive in terms of GDP. But I want to say this as well. For me, part of the appeal of the idea of the Green New Deal, for example, is that it's about a rebalancing of what we pay for on our own and what we do together. I think at some level, so many people feel so much pressure to make money and all this stuff because, we're worried about our kids, paying for our kids' daycare and post-secondary education and our parents' elder care and our retirement and all this stuff. And to me, underlying all of the social infrastructure in the Green New Deal is saying to people, And incidentally, all this stuff in the caring economy that's already low carbon, you know, all that anxiety you feel about making enough money to pay for childcare, don't worry, we're going to do that together. And to pay for your kids' post-secondary education, chill out, we're going to do that together. And for your own retirement and your parents' elder kid, relax, we're going to do that together from now on. And so it's a rebalancing of what we do together. And in that rebalancing, we will all feel a need to make less, have less disposable income, and a little more time, and shift our priorities. That was true, by the way, in the war with rationing, you know, that people, you know, in some ways were able to spend less, and yet, you know, remember it as some of the best years of their lives because they were engaged in a collective endeavor.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point in terms of how do you shift that balance? And of course, Beveridge and Marsh in the original British welfare state, you didn't have to worry about retirement. And once the Thatcherism and the whole neoliberal vein took effect, all of a sudden, all these folks who never worried about it because they had been told they had been taken care of, all of a sudden started to worry about it. And I think that created a lot of this distrust of government. Yeah. that and we've done, you know, to a large degree, again, get back to Dick, the Canada Assistance Plan allowed us to develop through the 70s, you know, not perfect, but a pretty reasonable social safety net, as you say, that allowed us to live our lives as opposed to obsessing with worrying about financial commitments going forward. So,
well, you see it in that chart that I showed you earlier. But I also think, you know, on the question of jobs that we were talking about earlier, like I am convinced that when we get serious about this and spend what we have to take and create the new economic institutions, we're going to produce more jobs than we're losing in the fossil fuel industry. But will all of those new jobs pay the same six-figure salaries or wages that some people in the oil patch have come to expect? Probably not. But nor do they need to, not when we rebalance this way.
Okay, I think I'm going to give the last question to Victoria and kind of bring it back to the ground a little bit here. Aside from typical things such as using reusable bags, recycling, and similar things, what can I as a university student do to bring about powerful change?
Well, that's a great question. So first of all, you know, on the reusable bag stuff, all of that personal stuff is important, but there is a critique in my book of the environmental movement individualizing the solutions for too long. That is the thing about mobilizing for the climate emergency and the war. These are both inherently collective enterprises. And they need to be state-led. So while we all need to do those individual things and change how we get around and fuel swap our homes and all of those things, the most urgent task is a political task. And Victoria, I think it was, who's a student, you're already leading it. I mean, I feel such gratitude for the student-led climate mobilizations that we've seen over the last 2 years. The global student-led climate strikes have shifted the terrain of political opinion and culture and political possibility. And it's played out locally too. I mean, I like to give the example, if I may, I'm a little biased in this story, Tim, but you know, we don't have a federal or provincial government with a real climate emergency plan. The city of Vancouver has a real climate emergency plan. And now I'm biased because my wife's a city councillor in Vancouver, and she introduced the climate emergency motion a couple of years ago. And it wasn't just symbolic, right? Vancouver, unlike the province, unlike the country, has said no new buildings will be able to use natural gas for space and water heating as of next year. That's an emergency. And some key measures on buildings are driving about 50% of the reduction in GHG emissions in Vancouver over this decade. So that's real. Now, but here's about the politics. Now, those climate emergency motions in Vancouver passed unanimously, even though those of us who live in Vancouver know we have this very weird political split. No political party has a majority. Let me tell you, you never know how this gang's going to vote. It's not like the old days. It's real politics. Now they passed unanimously. How is that possible? Well, I would say, some of that's because my wife's really good at her job. But she would say that they're unanimous because of people like Victoria. Because each time those votes happened, a whole bunch of students, particularly high school students, skipped school, rallied outside, spoke before council, filled the galleries, and watched each vote, and basically made it politically impossible for even the conservative councillors to vote no. You did that. And now climate isn't a political wedge issue in Vancouver, it's unanimous. And that's a great model for the rest of the country. I can see we're out of time. Can I say one final thing in conclusion, Tim?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Which is just to say, I'm going to spend the next few years, like all of you, I hope, trying to animate these ideas and move them forward. I actually have, I'm launching a new initiative called the Climate Emergency Unit as a project of the David Suzuki Institute. And we're going to be trying to build mobilization for these ideas. We haven't got our website up and running, but I'll hopefully, when we've got all of that, I can send you a note about it, Tim, and you can share it with the registrants. And but let me say this final thought and bring it full circle with your point about, your family and these connections. I suspect, unless there's someone very old on the call, none of us here today, or very few, were alive in World War II. But, I think the people who stick it out in a talk like this have an appreciation for history. And a lot of us read books and watch films about the war because that's what the Netflix streams is telling us. And I suspect when people do, there's a question in your head. And it's this: what would I have done if I had lived then and there? Maybe a lot of UBC students, when they study this stuff, are thinking that same question. But today, as the future of our children is thrown into doubt and another civilizational threat arrives at our doorstep, the answer to that question is really no great mystery. The answer to that question is whatever we're each ready to do now.
Great. Well, thank you, Seth. It's been really engaging and really informative, and like you said at the beginning, it's nice to hear an optimistic vision to say, we can do this without the world ending. I also thought some of the questions and the comments, one of the things that gives me hope is, I grew up in a generation where it was university students protesting and part of all that, but the high school kids are incredible now. Like I said, the school strike, their level of information, their willingness to go to the wall on things, to me, that's one of the more hopeful signs as well, that somehow in this neoliberal madness, we're raising a generation of really great kids who are going to lead this, I think. But certainly your thoughts and leadership and intellectual leadership on this is appreciated by me, and I'm sure by all our guests tonight. And most have hung in for an hour and a half. So I think that speaks volumes to the talk. So I would like to thank our partners, Patsy George, who is always tireless in working on this lecture, as well as numerous other social justice issues. So as always, Patsy, it's a pleasure to work with you on this. Lindsay, Marsh, and Joelle Lee, we couldn't have done this without you this year, the technology, and it's gone remarkably smoothly for someone who's somewhat technically challenged. So just a big shout out to Lou and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. And I would just remind everyone that if you want more, we will be posting the talk. The link is in the chat function. But also in your registration, there should have been information around how you can go out and purchase The Good War and follow that up. So encourage you all to do that. And I really look forward to welcoming you all back, hopefully live and in person, for next year's Splane Lecture. So once again, a virtual, everybody can do the little clap thing on the, oh, we don't have our little reactions buttons, but Seth, imagine 102 clapping things on the thing, because that was really fabulous. So thank you again for your time and your thoughts and your leadership on this, and look forward to the good war. Okay, good night, everybody.